Hello and welcome to another video to help you play better chess. So the title of this video is Khan's Wrath and using imbalances to help you win. So let's take a look at this. We have a game with Sultan Khan, a lesser known player. Maybe some people are familiar with this player. He was an outstanding player. I think he only played for a few years and then kind of disappeared. But he beat some of the top players in the world, including Jose Capablanca, the third world chess champion. So this game, it looks like Khan played at a 90% accuracy rating versus 84.9 by Capablanca. So, maybe Capablanca had an off day, but it looks like Khan had four great moves, Capablanca had one. And then as far as bad moves, it looks like three inaccuracies by Khan, four by Capablanca, but Capablanca had two mistakes and Khan had one miss. So the computer states that Khan played at a 2450 rating level and Capablanca played at 2250. So, perhaps Capablanca had an off day. Maybe he was unfamiliar with this opponent and his playing style and it just gave him some trouble. So let's take a look here and see what happens. I'll turn on the computer analysis and the game begins with Khan playing knight to f3, the ready opening. So this is a flexible move. It controls these two center squares, of course, but it kind of waits to see what your opponent will do. So Capablanca follows suit. He plays knight to f6, also waiting to see how his opponent will continue. And today we're going to talk about imbalances. So, as we go through this game, keep that in mind that sometimes if you unbalance the position, where it leads to one side having a different group of material or different type of material than the opponent, they might have equal material, but maybe somebody has a bishop pair and the other person has the knights or a knight and a bishop. We'll see how you can use these imbalances in the position to try and go for a win. So we have d4 by Khan taking control of the center finally, and his opponent Capablanca plays kind of a Queen's Indian setup, getting ready to fianchetto his bishop. If he puts the bishop here, it'll be aiming through the center down towards the king side. So because Capablanca did not fight for the center immediately with pawns, the opponent pushes the c pawn. And, that's a standard move when you push the d pawn. Often you want to push the c pawn, having these pawns side by side, and they control a lot of territory. So also the knight is free to jump in behind the pawn and not block that pawn in. All right, so the bishop is developed, and now we have the knight moving forward, helping to fight for the center. Finally, Capablanca moves a center pawn here, maybe with the idea of pushing this pawn next and counterattacking, or I should say, finally fighting for the center there. You don't want to let your opponent just gain control of the center and run you over. Because especially these four squares are the most important area on the board. Unless the king is under attack, of course, then that becomes the most important area. Or I guess you could say if your opponent is threatening something. But in general, you want to control the center here because the center is kind of like the high ground on the battlefield. From these four squares, you can look down over every other point on the board, and this larger center area here is also very important. Also, the pieces, if they're stationed in the center, they can get to anywhere else on the board a little bit faster than if you have all your pieces on one side and you have to move them all the way to the other side. So the game continues with this move, a3. It doesn't really control the center, but what it does do is prevent the bishop from developing here to b4 and pinning that knight, and the knight is controlling the center. So I guess indirectly this helps fight for the center by preventing a pin on that knight, and that knight is instrumental in helping fight for the center. All right, so we have d5. Capablanca finally strikes in the center. And what does Khan do? Well, he decides to capture, and the game continues with the pawn capture. If the knight would have captured, there's a possibility of maybe chasing that knight away with a pawn move and placing both these pawns in the center. Capturing with the pawn does keep things even. And it looks like, this is one of the imbalances in the position. We see that black has this half open E file and white has the half open C file. So these two half open files, they're generally good areas to place rooks on half open files. So white may try to fight on the half open C file, whereas black could fight along the half open E file. So the game continues with more developing moves. Khan places his bishop on g5, pinning the knight to the queen. So Capablanca develops the bishop and breaks the pin. So one way to play better chess is to try and find moves that accomplish more than one thing. So this bishop developing move breaks the pin on the knight, develops a piece off the back rank, and you always want to try and get those pieces developed as quickly as possible, and it sets black up for a kingside castling move. So, that move kind of accomplished three things in one there. All right. We have e3, and another thing that might help you play better chess is to develop your bishop when you have a bad bishop, and a bad bishop is one that is on the same colored squares as the center pawns. So we see these central pawns are on the dark squares, and the dark squared bishop can become blocked by these pawns. So often it can be good to develop your bishop outside the pawn chain, and that way you're not blocked in and restricted on your side of the board if the bishop had not developed here to g5. All right, so kingside castling for the former world chess champion Capablanca, and now we have the bishop developing to d3. And so far, after 9 moves here, the game's pretty even. We have finally a piece moving twice here, and we're kind of still in the opening, but pretty much going into the middle game. And usually you don't want to move a piece twice unless you have a good reason. So here, this places the knight on this outpost square on his opponent's side of the board. Also, there's an attack on the bishop here, and usually it's a good strategy to try and get rid of your opponent's bishop pair. So Khan finds the best move, avoiding the loss of his bishop, retreating here, lining up on this pawn, which, if the rook moves here to the half open file, they could pile up on that backwards pawn there. So the game continues with a developing move by Capablanca. And, one more thing that can help you play better chess is when you have a knight on an outpost like this, and if you're not familiar with an outpost, it's a square where usually the piece is protected by a pawn and it cannot be attacked by enemy pawns. And, hopefully it's on your opponent's side of the board like this knight is. Now here, this pawn could move forward, but that would take some time. You'd have to move the knight out of the way, and it would weaken the king side a little bit. And, something that can help you is when you have this knight like this on the outpost, you want to prepare the other knight to back that first knight up. So if the knight jumps here, it would back up the knight that is placed further forward. So here we have another developing move by Khan. He plays queen to c2, creating a queen bishop battery here, adding more pressure to this knight. And Bobby Fischer, if you're not familiar with him, former world champion from 72 to 75, and that's 1972 to 75. He had a great philosophy where he felt that if any time your opponent had pieces on your side of the board, you wanted to immediately try and eject those pieces, trade them off, get them out of your territory. Because the longer they stay in your territory and the more enemy pieces in your territory, the more likely something bad may happen. Maybe loss of material or, even a checkmate. Okay, here we go. We have the knight being further fortified in the center by both of these pawns, and then maybe Capablanca is looking to jump his other knight in here and back up the first knight. So here, Khan jumps his knight forward, adding more pressure to this pawn along with the queen and the bishop. So everything's piling up here. Now, if one of the pieces takes that pawn, maybe there could be an issue with something pinning a piece to the queen. But, of course, this rook has to also guard this pawn, I guess, to prevent the knight from capturing that. So the game continues here. And here shortly, we will get to the theme of this video, which is using imbalances to win. Now, we already saw that there is a little bit of an imbalance with the half-open e-file, which black can try to use to attack with. But at the moment, that knight is kind of blocking lines of attack here. But the c-file is pretty open, and Khan is already applying the pressure here. So the first mistake of the game is made by Capablanca. He develops his bishop. What does the computer say he should have played instead? Well, it looks like g5. This would have been a better move, to push the pawn to g5, attacking the bishop. And then, maybe the game would continue with bishop captures, attacking the queen. And the best move is to just step the queen to the side. And it looks like now just a retreat, offering a queen trade because Khan is ahead by a pawn if the game would have gone this way. And remember, if you go ahead in material, that can be a material imbalance. And that's a way to win. If you go ahead, even by one pawn, there's a potential to trade all the pieces down and use that extra pawn to win in the end game. Now, if you're behind a pawn, you want to avoid trading those pieces and try and trade as many pawns as you can to reduce the chances that your opponent would promote those pawns in the end game. So, if we go back to the mistake move made by Capablanca here, he developed the bishop, trying to cover this pawn, stopping the diagonal, the attack here that this bishop has. So what does Khan do? Well, he finds the best move, of course, and takes the bishop, knocking out Capablanca's bishop pair. So another big imbalance here. Not only do we have different half-open files to fight on, but now we're going to have a imbalance in the material where Khan has the bishop pair and Capablanca has only the one light squared bishop. Now, how can you use this imbalance to try and win? Well, if you have the bishop pair, they're generally better in open positions. Now, right now, the center's kind of blocked up here. so these bishops aren't as strong. And maybe Capablanca was thinking about that when he decided to get rid of his bishop pair. But if you have the bishop pair, also, you notice that there's a dark squared bishop here now that Capablanca doesn't have. So the bishop pair can favor the attacker, especially if you can find a way to use this dark squared bishop to your advantage. So the game continues with this move, which is best. Now, why don't they like the immediate capture of the pawn here? I guess we could take a look at that if we go back. What would happen if you capture here? Well, now this would be a blunder. Let's see why. Well, it looks like what? Knight could just capture that. So, all right, I probably shouldn't have even played that move. Yeah, it's just a overlooked knight here, so of course that wouldn't be played. So just ignore that I mentioned that. Back to what happened in the game. So of course that's why he didn't just capture this, because the knight is covering that. And another example of why the knight is so powerful on an outpost, sometimes it's called an octopus, where the knight can cover 8 squares in the center, and it's like the tentacles of an octopus reaching out here and covering the entire board. All right, back to the imbalances here. So the game continues here with Khan playing the best move, gaining space on the king side. And, that's a way to play better chess, is try to gain more space than your opponent, giving your pieces more freedom and mobility to move with that extra space. Whereas if you cramp your opponent's position, their pieces will have less options and maybe find it harder to be placed on good squares because there might not be that many. So the game continues with the rook towards the center, also attacking the queen. So where does this queen go? It plays the inaccurate move here according to the computer, queen to b3. The computer just recommended stepping over here to e2, kind of staying in the center. And now, this move isn't terrible. White is still ahead here by 0.82, but he would have been over a pawn equivalent advantage if he would have stayed with the queen in the center on e2. All right, the game continues with an inaccuracy followed up by another inaccuracy here, with Capablanca moving his queen to the center, but now that's not the best move. It looks like knight at d to f6. So, that's an important move because the knight can immediately jump into f6 and control or help cover the knight on the outpost. All right, so Capablanca has that knight sitting on e4 here. And so Khan needs to do something about that. Maybe he drops back here and gets ready to try and knock that knight out of there. But now Capablanca finds the best move, reinforcing the knight. So we have capture, and Capablanca could capture here with the pawn, undoubling his pawns. But this is just such a good square for the knight. And instead, he decides not to place the knight on the outpost, capturing towards the center. This does gain a little bit of initiative because now the bishop is under attack and has to retreat. So Capablanca now prepares to double the rooks, trying to use that half-open c-file. The game continues with a counter strike on the king side, threatening to just start marching these pawns up, storming towards the opponent's king. The rooks double up, an inaccuracy. Apparently, queen to f7 is a little bit better move because I guess there could be the chance to push a pawn, attack that knight. Of course, the knight could go forward and then try and knock out the bishop pair. But I guess in the meantime, the queen would be able to capture with check, maybe giving that bishop time to retreat. So queen to f7 would have been a better move, helping fortify this pawn if the queen was on f7. All right, so we have the knight being chased away. Instead of moving forward, we have a retreating move. Apparently, knight to d7 may have been slightly better, but at this point, Khan has the advantage. The game continues with the bishop grabbing this open diagonal, attacking the rook. Now we have a checking move. The king steps forward, finding the best move instead of, you don't want to just take, because then the other rook would have captured with check and then this rook would have fallen. So the best move is played. We have check to the king. So now the only option here is to capture with the queen, and another imbalance arises here. So now we have the two rooks that Khan has versus the queen. Now, generally, rooks are worth about 5 pawns apiece, for a total of 10, versus the queen, which is worth about 9 pawns. So this is an interesting imbalance. Two rooks can be a little bit more powerful than the queen, but you have to make sure your king is safe, that the queen can't just start forking pieces and picking off pawns. And the two rooks have to make sure that they're coordinated, that they're working in tandem, protecting one another. That way, once again, the queen can't fork the pieces and the king and grab material. So we have a check. The king steps to the side, but this is not the best way to go. So some of Khan's advantage has dissipated here. It looks like king to b1 would have been the best move, allowing maybe the other rook to swing over, attacking the queen. But we'll see why this is a not particularly the best move for Khan because of this move. So now there's a threat to move in here, delivering a check and just harassing the king. Now this move stops that, but now the queen attacks this pawn, threatening to capture with check. So the rook guards that, but once again, a king move would have been better, moving the king to c1 here. So now the game continues with another mistake by Capablanca with this king to f7 move. We'll see why that's a mistake. Looks like bishop to c6 would have been the best move. So bishop to c6, and then what do they recommend? Moving the other rook to the c file, attacking that unprotected bishop. But then the bishop would be able to move here, trying to trade off this defending bishop, knocking out the bishop pair. And that is a good plan. If your opponent has the bishop pair, often it can be a good idea to get rid of one of those bishops, and then that reduces the danger of the bishop pair. Now, of course, the center is kind of blocked, so the bishop pair is not quite as strong as it could be. But back to the game. After this mistake move, we have the rook grabbing the open file. Now, there could be a threat of these rooks, one pressing forward, attacking the queen. They could try and double up at some point. So we have the king moving towards the center, and that's usually a good strategy as you go from the middle game into the end game. Generally, you don't want to have your king... Oh, also, the king kind of helps defend this pawn, which is under attack. Now the knight is defending, but that could free up that knight from guard duty in the future. The knight is also covering this square to prevent a check by the rook. Okay, the queen was under attack. It repositions here. Capablanca finds the best move according to the computer, and the game continues with a space-gaining pawn push on the queen side. The queen drops back further. Here it's eyeing both of these diagonals, but the computer doesn't like that, saying that's an inaccuracy, that bishop to c6 would have been better. Maybe once again with the idea of trying to trade off this defensive bishop here. So the rooks double up, and now we have a pawn push, preventing maybe more space gaining maneuvers with b5. So the game continues with the rook remaneuvering here, since there's not much that can be done on the open c file. Now that's something to remember, and hopefully this will help you play better chess too. You want to try and control open files. Like both of these rooks, when they're doubled up here, they're trying to control the open c file, but they can't really make it into the opponent's position because the knight is covering that, the bishop is covering these squares, the queen is backing all that up. So there's not a way for that bishop pair, or excuse me, the pair of rooks to move into the opponent's position. Sure, they're aiming up that open file, but they can't make any forward progress really. So Khan repositions his rook over to the g file, maybe with the intention of gaining even more space, pushing the pawn further up the board. So we have a queen attack going after the unprotected pawn here. And, another inaccuracy according to the computer. Once again, they wanted that bishop move. Maybe once the bishop got there, they could try and reposition, or excuse me, knock out that defender after it repositioned there. But that didn't happen. The queen is attacking the pawn, but that is ignored. So now there could be a threat here of rook attacking. If the knight captures, the other rook attacks with check. The king would have to move, and the bishop could be knocked off. So that would give up one rook for two minor pieces, which is worth it. So that's the threat. So this pawn can't be captured here, and the queen drops back to help defend against that threat. So now we have more space gaining pawn moves, but over here on the king side, the king repositions to help cover this square and free up the queen from guard duty. And now we have just a little maneuvering by the rook here. And what follows is just maneuvering by both sides. So the king drops back maybe to reposition to b2, or something to that effect. The queen is now attacking this unprotected pawn. That is ignored, and the best move is to ignore that and move the king up to b2. Now, the pawn was not captured. Why would that be a bad move? Well, if that pawn is captured, there could be a potential discovered attack on the queen, and this bishop could just go up here, knocking that out, and then pick off the bishop there. So Capablanca does not fall for that, of course. He just remaneuvers his queen, kind of waiting to see what the opponent does. So they kind of just shuffle back and forth here for a little while. Finally, Khan pushes a pawn forward, trying to slowly gain some space now on the queen side. King steps forward, so slowly making some forward progress. And it looks like Capablanca is not sure what to do here. He's kind of stuck, I think. So now the bishop drops back, defending this pawn, freeing up this rook, from the discovered attack if the queen would grab that pawn. So things continue with the queen attacking the newly unprotected pawn on g5. So after this, we have a repositioning of the bishop, defending, and that's the best move. Capablanca finds the best move, attacking here, trying to stop this forward momentum of these pawns. But the other pawn pushes forward. So now we have a retreating move, which is best according to the computer. And the game continues with Khan just slowly working his pawns forward. Capablanca avoids exchanges. And now that bishop repositions, because from here it could push forward and have a better diagonal and defend the pawn as well. So, after the attack on the pawn, we have a defensive bishop move. And Capablanca, once again, is kind of shuffling around. And he's kind of, almost stuck here. Everything is pretty well defended. I mean, he could go after this pawn, which is at the base of the pawn chain. And that's generally what you want to do. You have this pawn chain, and the weakest link is the one in the back here. So that's usually what you want to go after. You could go after the one here, but there's nothing that can do that. You don't have any other pawns. So the king drops back. Now we have an attack on the unprotected pawn, but that is ignored. The best move apparently is to drop the king back to b1. Once again, well, I don't know. This move doesn't look as strong here because the bishop can't, capture anything if it moves. Where does it go? It would have to go here maybe. And then how do you use that to your advantage? Maybe you go up here and try and knock this bishop out, and then the rooks have access. So, in the game, Capablanca just played this. So let's see what happens if he takes this pawn. Well, now they recommend, wow, of all moves, bishop to h5? That's really the best move. Oh, okay. It looks like the queen would just be trapped. So, that's an interesting choice. That, you could go there and it wouldn't matter because the queen is trapped now. The queen can't go here, here. Well, hold on a minute. The queen can go there. So let's take a look at this. It's kind of interesting. Oh, but now the queen is finally trapped with that move. So if you're going to lose the queen, you might as well take as much material as you can. So you could go after this, but they actually recommend attacking here. And then after captures, now you can grab this, but maybe that's why bishop to h5 was best, because if you take, you're going to have this 3 versus 1 pawn majority, which will start storming up the board. And of course the queen would be gone. All right, let's see what happened here, how this game ended. Capablanca doesn't fall for any queen trapping tricks here. The king steps to the side, so more shuffling by both sides. Okay, finally the best move is found by Khan. Maybe he's trying to re-maneuver around here and trap this queen once again with something like this. We create a battery, and now that stopped this move, of course. But the rook jumps forward. Finally, the rooks are able to use, or one of the rooks is able to use this open c-file, targeting both of the pawns here. So the game continues with the queen moving and finding the best move here. Now there is a threat to capture this, target this, which would be pinned to the king. So the game continues with all of that being ignored with a counter threat. And this is something very important in chess. If you want to play better chess, and even I have trouble with this, often you'll see a threat by your opponent and your instinct is, oh, they're attacking or threatening me, I have to deal with this. And you might overlook an even more powerful counterattack that is stronger than their attack, and it forces them to stop what they're doing and deal with that. So they have to stop their plans and go on the defensive to deal with your plans. So, this move is threatening to capture with a check. So that has to be dealt with. The bishop jumps forward here, attacking, trying to get rid of the bishop pair. So once again, the best move is to ignore, or not ignore, but avoid the exchange of that bishop, keeping the strong bishop pair. So now we have a battery, maybe preparing to attack that bishop once again. That is prevented with this rook move. And now the queen pins that rook, or excuse me, pins the bishop to the rook. So, kind of interesting stuff. I guess there's a threat of moving here because if the bishop takes, you could grab that. All right, so the rook just steps over to the open file, maintains the guard on the bishop. So now we have Capablanca shuffling back, creating the battery once again. But this time the best move is found. And interestingly enough, it's to shift that king over towards the center, maybe to guard the pawn at the base of the chain. And also, I guess that move would prevent this move, if the king gets over here. So attack on the queen, offering up a free pawn. The pawn offer is accepted. The king steps to the middle. And now we have the battery being formed, but bishop and king are preventing that move. Khan starts picking off pawns, and we have a check to the king. King steps forward, and now a very dangerous passed pawn here, trying to work its way up the board. So after this move, we have the bishop grabbing this nice open diagonal. Queen creates a battery, maybe with the idea of covering that in the future. So the game continues with this rook move, and this is where Capablanca resigned. Now, why did he resign here? Well, we could take a look and see how the computer recommends the game continue. It looks like they recommend queen capturing on h6. Okay, grabbing the pawn, also lining up on the king. And I've mentioned this before, but another great way to play better chess is line up pieces on more important pieces. Of course, the king, if you get checkmated, you lose, so that's the most important piece. So the queen lines up on that king. pinning this pawn. So maybe there would be a way you could capture this, and that pawn could not recapture because of this pin. Also, if you could take a bishop or maybe line a bishop up on a rook or a rook up on the queen, but you get the idea. Take less valuable pieces and line them up on more valuable pieces, even if there's a lot of material in between, because you never know when things will open up. Okay, back to how this game could have continued. They recommend capturing here, and now what? Rook to d8. King. No, actually, they recommend that move, attacking the bishop. But now you have capture with check, king up to f7, and it's not looking good. Check. Now what? They recommend bishop to d7, just giving up the bishop. And it's bad when that is the best move. So after this, wow, well now you have that. You got to block with the queen, and the queen would fall. So if we go back, what are some other options here? The game ended here. So after rook to b8, instead of queen takes h6, king to f5. So that's also a recommended move. But, this pawn can start marching forward, or the recommended move is that, pinning the knight to the king. So the king steps over, attacking the pawn, but this knight has to be protected by the king as well. So, then it's not looking good. I don't think they can stop this pawn. So the best move apparently is to give up the queen by capturing here. That's just awful looking. Yeah, and there's no way to stop that. So that's why Capablanca resigned. All right. Well, remember to try and look for imbalances in the position, like Khan did here, or try to set up imbalances by knocking out the bishop pair or keeping it, where your opponent either, has the opposite. If you have the bishop pair and they don't, or vice versa, you can use that in some way. Also, look at the open files. If there's an open file on one side of the board or half open file, and your opponent has a different half open file, maybe you can use that to your advantage. But I recommend that you keep an eye out for those imbalances and look for ways to use them to give you an advantage. All right. Well, as always, feel free to leave comments. Let me know if there's anything on your mind, or if you have any requests for something you'd like to see in future videos. So also like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. And check out my other videos. I think I'm, over 1,100 videos on this channel. So hopefully you can find something in there that will help you play better chess. So thank you and have a super chess day.